Hello again. In this file, we're going to take a closer look at three of the major thinkers in the field of Gestalt psychology. They all share a fairly similar biographical story. They are all folks who are born in the late 1800s, live into the middle portion of the 1900s, and because of the generation they were a part of, and because they are all connected with Central Europe and Germany, they all end up leaving Germany during the Nazi threat. Um, not all of them were of Jewish background, but I think a couple of them are, and then others just in solidarity with the Jews often left. And all of these folks, all three of them, ended up in the United States to our advantage, I guess you might say, in psychology. So the first person we're going to look at is somebody we've already mentioned, Max Wertheimer. You see his information there. Born in the late 1800s, lived in 1943, and did a lot of his kind of groundbreaking work in Germany. Although, as I mentioned last time, he ended up in the United States at the New School of Social Research in New York, which had as one of its goals during that time to take in all of these immigrants. Might even call them refugees, I suppose, that had academic training and give them a place to practice their academic endeavors. And we've already mentioned that Wertheimer is really the pioneer of Gestalt psychology, especially in his studies of the five phenomena. He is also well known for studying the rules of perceptual organization beyond the five phenomenon. And really this whole focus on perception is what Gestalt psychologists have become most well known for. But as I think I mentioned in the last file, they also studied other things such as child development and so forth. So Kurt Levine, who we'll be talking about in just a few minutes, basically the founder of social psychology. They were actually a pretty diverse bunch. In any case, Wertheimer continued his exploration into perception and elaborated or elucidated several different rules that seem to govern human perception. One of these rules is closure, and the rule of closure basically tells us that when we see some kind of broken image, we try to kind of fill in the gaps in that image to make it make sense. Okay. So you can imagine perhaps a triangle that is drawn with the three sides not completely touching, right? So there's kind of gaps at the corner. We would still see that as a triangle for the most part, right? We kind of fill in those gaps. I'm going to have you watch a video after I talk about proximity. You see the link there, and you will see some examples of closure. Okay, another rule of perceptual organization is similarity. We tend to group similar things together and see that group as primary. So for example, in the video or in many textbooks, you may have seen a grid that maybe has equally spaced items in it, and they alternate by row. So one row might be pluses, the next row might be stars. All right, then back to pluses again for the third row, and then stars. And if all of the items in that table are equidistant apart, we will probably still perceive the table being organized in rows because similar objects are in rows together. That may sound a little bit hard to conceptualize right now, but again, when you see the video, you will understand what I mean. And then the rule of proximity, which means that we tend to lump together things that are located closer to, right? To be in proximity to something means to be close to it. Okay, so you'll see more examples of this in the video, but if there are rows of items, but some rows are closer to each other than other rows, we're more likely to see those rows that are closer together as kind of a group unto themselves. All right, so what I'd like you to do now is to click on the link to the video, and you're free to watch the whole thing if you wish, but at the very least, if you would fast forward to 1 minute and 53 seconds and watch it from there, you will get exposure to these rules. He'll also mention figure ground, but I want to show you something else to illustrate figure ground as well, so I'm not going to address it until after you've watched this video. Okay, so please go watch it and then come back here and we'll talk about figure ground. All right, so figure ground is a little bit different than the three rules that we've talked about so far, in that it has to do with almost with a three-dimensional element of visual perception. According to the principle of figure ground, we are almost always likely to perceive some things as being in the foreground of what we're seeing, and other things as being in the background. And with optical illusions, that can kind of alternate what's in the foreground, what's in the background, right? As we go through our life with depth perception, we use very regular cues to do this. You know, is one item overlapping another item? If so, it must be, you know, ahead of that item. Something smaller will be perceived as further away than something closer. But there are optical illusions where it can be very hard to figure out what is meant to be the foreground and what is meant to be the background. You know, and this just indicates general emphasis in Gestalt psychology that we're always like interpreting things stimuli relative to other stimuli. It's not necessarily like structuralism would have us, that we just break things down into isolated pieces, if you will. But we are always interpreting things relative to other things. So I'd like you to go to the link next to figure ground right now, and it's going to take you to a kind of a graphic online. And I just want you to notice that as you look at it, you'll see that there's kind of two general types of graphics, if you will, or figures in the picture. Just in your mind, switch back and forth between these two words, cross and pizza, and see how that changes what you perceive to be the foreground, what you perceive to be the background. Cross and pizza. After you take a look at that, you can go on to the next slide. All right, moving on to the second of three people we're talking about today. We're going to take a little look here at a guy who had kind of an interesting life, Wolfgang Köhler. That's my bad German. I guess whenever you have an umlaut over an O, you're supposed to pronounce it a little bit differently. Actually, I'm just going to call him Wolfgang Köhler. Okay, sorry to all you German scholars out there. You see that, you know, his life is more or less parallel with Wertheimer's. He lived a little bit longer, up to the great year of 1967. Although he was born in Estonia, which is east of Germany, he was of German descent, as you probably could tell by his name, and ended up working in Germany, and then along with Wertheimer and many other psychologists came to the US as the Nazis rose to power. He's best known for his work on insight, which is a kind of problem solving that involves seeing connections between elements of a problem. Okay, kind of problem solving that involves seeing connections between the elements of a problem in order to solve it. This is very similar to Wertheimer's idea of productive thinking, which I think you encounter in your book. I don't have it here at home where I'm recording, but I'm pretty sure it's in there. If you're not familiar, by the way, with that little CF that you see there at the beginning of the third bullet, that's an abbreviation. I think it's of a Latin phrase, but basically it just means compare to. Okay, so compare this to Wertheimer's idea of productive thinking, which is a very similar idea. Köhler is most well known for studying insight, actually not so much with people, but with apes. He spent the early part of the 1900s on an island called Tenerife. Tenerife is located off the northwest coast of Africa, so he's kind of hanging out in the Atlantic Ocean during, well, among other years, the years that were World War I. So we're talking the 19-teens. In fact, there is some discussion, questioning, I suppose, of whether or not he actually might have been there for dual purposes, not only to do psychological research, but to do some spying during the war. In any case, we're just going to talk about his psychological research. You see that there is a link there that's going to take you to a 5-minute video or so that starts off with some more modern day footage of apes engaging in problem solving, but then it's actually going to take you back to some of Kohler's original footage, very black and white, very, bad quality because it was taken a long time ago. But just notice how when they're put into these problem solving situations, even apes are able to see links between the different items in their environment and the problem that they need to solve. So in the first clip there in the video, you'll see how an ape solves the problem of a peanut out of a narrow plastic tube that he can't get his fingers into. All right, you see he kind of looks around his environment and kind of connects things, right? This Gestalt idea of the whole, in other words, what all around me and the links between all of those items is not simply the same as each of these individual items on their own. Then, as it gets into Kohler's original footage, it's a little bit hard to see, but you're going to see an ape with some boxes. And he's trying to get a banana. It's a little bit hard to see the banana, but trust me, there's a banana up there, and I'll let you see how he tries to figure that out. And then you'll also see an ape trying to get something. Can't remember exactly what it is, but it's on the other side of a fence. Okay, so you'll see how even these apes engage in problem solving by trying to link things together, items together that they have in their environment. Take a look at the video, and then we'll move on to the next slide. All right, the last person we're going to talk about in this file, and one of my absolute psychology heroes, as you can see by the picture. I didn't make that picture, but I thought it was a very well-deserved alteration to this picture of Kurt Levine. He is Superman. Kurt Levine, just like these other guys we've been talking about, was from Germany originally. You see the word Prussia there. If you're not aware, Prussia is northern Germany, basically. And before Germany became a united country, it was broken into regions, and Prussia was one of those regions. You see his dates there pretty much parallel these other guys we're talking about, and he, like the rest of them, came over here in the 1930s. Levine is most well known for generating what we call field theory, which usually is summarized succinctly in that little formula you see right there. That looks a little bit intimidating in some ways, but actually it's a fairly simple idea to grasp. In fact, it might be so simple you might be thinking, well, why are we even talking about this? That's obvious. But we're going to make the case that back in Levine's time it wasn't obvious. You see the formula B is a function of P and E. Well, what does that mean? B here stands for behavior. Okay, and F, of course, maybe you know from your math classes, stands for function. Levine maintained that behavior is a function of the person and the environment together. Okay, so there's like an interaction between the person and the environment, which, again, that doesn't sound too startling to us probably today. I mean, you probably know just based on your own life that, in some environments, you as a person might behave one way. In another environment, you might behave slightly differently. Okay, but at the time, I mean, let's put him in his context, right? I mean, the 1920s, 30s, probably the two major models that existed at the time were behaviorism in the United States, which was all about the environment, and the psychodynamic approach, which we'll be talking about next, which was really all about the person. And so Levine, like a good Gestalt person, is saying, no, it's not one or the other, it's both, and it's how they're connected to each other. Moreover, we can't just look at the environment like a behaviorist does, right? In other words, what kind of reinforcements and punishments or, stimuli exist around me right now. But the environment basically includes multiple factors, multiple levels. Yes, there's your immediate environment, but there's also, the cultural environment, and nowadays with the globalization, international environment. And so he really kind of saw all these different levels that affected people. And by the way, for those of you who have had child development with me, or human diversity. We talk about this other person in both of those. This may sound a little bit familiar. Ooh, multiple levels, right? I mean, shall we say microsystem, exosystem, right? If you don't know what those terms, don't worry, okay? Don't write them down. I'm not going to test you on them in this class, but just to connect this to something some of you already know. You might remember the name Urie Bronfenbrenner. Urie Bronfenbrenner was explicitly indebted to Kurt Levine. He wrote about it, Bronfenbrenner wrote about it himself, for starting this discussion of having to look at the environment as more than just the immediate environment around me right now. Okay. Levine, in some ways, is kind of a Renaissance man. He worked in many different areas of psychology. We don't see that much with his generation or nowadays even. He was a Gestalt psychologist and studied perception, but he also did an awful lot with child development. And he, in many ways, is considered to be the founder of social psychology, or one of the founders. So he was working at himself many different levels within psychology. One of the things he's most famous for is a series of experiments done on leadership styles and how they influence productivity. And you see a link to a little video clip there, and I'll ask you to go to that in just a moment. But when you go there, you're going to see some old footage from one of Levine's most famous experiments, where they were looking at 3 different kinds of leadership styles and how those leadership styles influenced children's problem solving and productivity. And they did this in kind of a Boy Scout kind of atmosphere, where they had these groups of elementary age boys come together and work on projects together. And there was always an adult, of course, with them. And in some cases, the adult would be democratic, right? So letting the boys make decisions, but guiding them, but turning a fair amount of the voice, if you will, the power over to the kids, but still being involved. With some groups, the adult was authoritarian, so basically just dictated what they should do without letting the kids contribute at all as they were building their models or whatever they were doing. And then in the third case, there was an adult who was really kind of not involved. Levine called it the laissez-faire. You might remember that word or that term from your studies of civics and government, laissez-faire, where the adult just basically sat back and watched. And what he found in those studies is that the children who had a democratic adult who was involved and connected with the kids, but also let them make a lot of the decisions, got the best work out of the kids. So I'll take a look at that video clip. The video clip talks about, I can't remember the other researcher's name. Levine was not the only person who participated in these studies, so please don't be bothered by the fact that they mention somebody else's name and not Levine. It's also his work, and those videos are often shown in discussions of Kurt Levine. All right, so take a look at that video, and this will close down our discussion of Gestalt psychology, this really kind of exciting movement influenced by philosophy and physics, growing up in a very fertile time in Germany at the century. And like several other schools of thought, as we'll see, basically led to an exodus out of Germany in the 1930s. Came here and had a really strong influence on research on perception, research on child development, and in many ways ended up in the founding of social psychology through the work of Kurt Levine. Thanks. Enjoy your day.